So hello, everyone. My name is Anisha Padma, and I am a third year doctoral student in the interdepartmental program in anthropology and history here at the University of Michigan. I'm also one of the co-organizers of the In and Out of South Asia Race, Capitalism and Mobility Conference hosted by the Center for South Asian Studies. Given that we've already gone in and out of traditional conference formats, I thought I would offer a few words of reflection. It seemed rather odd to think of offering closing remarks for a conference when one, we still have one more panel to go, and two, this conference was really envisioned to be a springboard for new directions and avenues for research rather than a destination for fully fledged ideas. Yesterday and today, I've been really inspired by the breadth and depth of conversations initiated by our panelists and faculty discussants. Some important interventions that come to mind as we chart new intellectual journeys are considering the translational equivalences of racism and anti-Blackness, thinking across and between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean geographies, keeping in mind both oceanic linkages as well as the significance of historical specificities of each context. Another intervention came from Professor Neha Vora, who reminded us that our readings of modernity and race are largely coming from the British Empire, and that we must seriously think transimperially and transcolonially, lest we reproduce another form of coloniality in our scholarship. These interventions demonstrate new intellectual and political commitments shared by scholars of this conference, a departure from previously established modalities of thought within South Asian studies that have made it impossible to deparochialize and deterritorialize race and caste. I want to end by reiterating how this conference is not the final destination for these ideas, but merely a platform for further development. We envision the website to carry the afterlives of this conference, whether by acting as a living archive for the initial ideas presented here, or hosting multimedia and shorter written pieces as these ideas take flight. And we invite participants to continue to engage with us. So thank you very much for your attention and participation, and I will turn it over to my colleague and co-organizer, Irene Pramod.
Thank you so much, Anisha. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted to just have all of you here, especially for this closing panel. And we really hope it will be yet another generative set of discussions, as it has been over the past couple of panels, both yesterday and today. So today's panel, the last one of the day, is titled Critiquing the Nation State 2. It's the second of the Critiquing the Nation State panel series in this conference. And this panel will be led by two faculty discussants, Professor Mandana Limbert, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at CUNY, and Professor Anneeth Kaur Hundle, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. And we'll have four panelists today who will be taking us through their work, and faculty discussants will also be offering some of their own reflections and questions to panelists based on their pre-circulated panelist submissions, which everyone should have been able to view on the Dropbox folder. We'll begin with Kelvin from Yale University. His paper is titled The Labor of Self-Respect, Political Equality and Labor Migration from 1929 to 1940. We will then move to Darakhsha, who is from Jamia Millia Islamia University, and her paper is titled Aryan Theory in South Asia, the Role of Race in the Development of Cultural and Ethnic Nationalism in India and Sri Lanka in the 19th century. We will then move to Arshad Said Khan from the University of Alberta, whose paper is titled Of Turkman Gate and Lutyen's Delhi, Hijra, Commons, and Mobility in Three Texts. And finally, we will conclude with Sonia Qadir's paper, and she's from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and her paper is titled Thinking in Mobilities on the Margins of Pakistan's Legal Security State. And as you can see, there's a tremendous breadth of themes that we'll be dealing with here today, and we're really excited. So before, as we get into this, I'm just going to invite our faculty discussants. either Professor Limbert or Professor Hundle, either way, to offer very brief kind of mini keynote kind of reflections on some of the themes of the panel, how they relate to some of your own work, your own interests. And yeah, so I'll leave it to either of you. I'm not sure who would like to proceed first.
Either way, I'm whatever you want to do is fine.
You can go ahead, Professor.
Go ahead, yes, please.
You want me to go? Okay. So, I mean, really, thank you all for this incredibly kind invitation to join you at this great conference. I mean, I'm really honored, sincerely honored to be included, but of course saddened by the fact that we couldn't all be in Ann Arbor again. I miss Ann Arbor, I have to say. So it was great to be there virtually. I'm especially grateful to be included as like some of the speakers yesterday. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in a broader Indian Ocean conversation, something that I'm finding, honestly, a rarity, despite the explosion of interest and work. In fact, it's to this broader conversation I wanted to focus my comments. Reading the papers for the panel really brought home to me how important it is to push against the siloing of regions and subregions, as I understand is the aim with the conference, even while we might focus on the particularities of debates, practices, and processes. Frankly, I wish in my own work I could attend more explicitly to the Eastern Indian Ocean and the overlaps and relations and debates of the social world of early and mid-century Zanzibar and Oman that has drawn my attention. As I've most recently been focused on the messy and yet powerful alignment of territory, subjecthood, and race through the 20th century in Oman and in the Oman-Zanzibar axis, I wish I could address, without the simplified labels that stand in for social, political, and economic groups, a more explicit South Asian component to this work. Anyway, this is another way of saying thank you. I am, however, always concerned about the deployment of labels, even while I recognize that when unpacking them, we sometimes need to rely on other labels for the analytic labor they can provide. It is for this reason that I found it helpful when rethinking what Arabness is to consider the processes of ethnicization and racialization that have produced it, shifting from other forms of status and hierarchy that appear more tied to genealogy, indeed more caste-like. It was precisely at a very basic level my own reaction to such simplified labels of Arab and nation that initially spurred me to think about how notions of Arabness and nation were shifting. Whether it was from the perspective of a scholarship on East Africa that brilliantly recognized the complex racialized politics and policies of the 19th and 20th centuries while retaining Arabness as a given, or from the perspective of literature on Arab nationalist politics that projected affinities across a region where neither language nor political aspiration gelled. It seemed to me that perhaps it was worth considering how this came to be. And in fact, how were the legacies of slavery and servitude manifesting in these presumptions about Arabness? Same with nation. In the particular context of the early to mid 20th century Western Indian Ocean, anti-colonial intellectuals that spoke of homeland did not necessarily all mean nation state, of course. It is not that there was no notion of homeland to which people belonged until it was imposed by a European colonial order, but the contours of a homeland were not the territorial model. Indeed, and this is where we might want to be careful too, the idea of unfettered mobility until European colonialism, besides the constraints of difficulty, ignores, for example, religious obligations and ethical debates about how to live in a righteous society, of being home. Nevertheless, as British officials aimed to manage movement across the seas between the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, as we know, they increasingly worked with a model that people were territorial subjects, not only spatial ones, even if implementing the model was messy and unclear and ambiguous and convoluted and confused. And most profoundly, how can one begin to understand what was at stake in these labels and categories without acknowledging the power and tensions around gender and sex, marriage or concubinage and children, power and citizenship as membership or representation discussed in the last panel, along with the much less visible but profoundly political realm of sexual life. At the same time, of course, and this is the question that I struggle with often, is there a difference between when a category or term means different things to different people or moments, and when a term carries with it multiple meanings or changes meanings? Can we make that distinction? For scholars working with colonial bureaucracies, for instance, we recognize that different departments might define differently their categories. And it's when a policy that cuts across these departments becomes a matter of debate that these confusions get addressed and maybe even attempted to get worked out. Perhaps we somehow have to be aware of both. It's a difficult balance, and we end up making our choices and sending our writing out into the world.
Thank you so much, Professor Limbert. Thank you for that. Perhaps now, Professor Hundle, would you like to? No, just a brief keynote would be.
Sure, yes, I'm happy to jump in. Thank you so much, Professor Limbert. That was excellent. Again, I wanted to thank all of the organizers, all of the students. This is just a fantastic program. I'm also honored to be invited. And I was most impressed by the website that you were able to put together. It's so beautiful and very well done. And I'm excited to continue this conversation and maintain a collaboration with all of you. So when I was looking actually at the framing of the conference and it was sent to me for the first time, I actually thought back to my time, obviously as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and how much I would have benefited from having a conference like this at that time. When I was working on putting together my dissertation project, I was actually doing an ethnography of the university in some sense. I was trying to piece together a training across area studies fields, both African studies and South Asian studies. There was also a kind of emerging field of Sikh studies that I was involved with at that time. That was also a very kind of minoritized field of knowledge production. And much of the scholarship that I was reading was still very territorially based in the nation state and being developed through strong methodological nationalisms in which diasporic community or minority frameworks to talk about South Asian-ness were still mainstream. And this scholarship that was informed by area studies and methodological nationalism also had with it an implicit racial politics, or racial politics of knowledge production. And so I became very concerned with these kind of dominant knowledge formations in the university and the ways in which I was contending with dominant racialized, religious, and caste formations across these fields. However, at this time, there was also new Indian Oceanic-based scholarship, especially in history, historiography, and that helped me to rescale my own work across transregional spatialities and out of the kind of like South Asian diasporic framework that I had grown up with in the US. And so in my own work, I was exploring how cross-Indian Ocean migrations of South Asians into East Africa in the prior century and in the context of decolonization, how all of this came to be connected to North Atlantic migrations via exodus and expulsion at the time of independence in post-colonial Uganda. And in my research, I found that these migrations were actually continuing. There were reverse migrations of Ugandan Asians and East African Asians back to Africa. And there were also new South-South migrations happening in the global South between India and Africa. And I had to map all of this and figure out a language to sort of understand what was going on. And that language wasn't readily available to me in the classes that I was taking. So I think thinking about In and Out South Asia is about figuring out research methodologies and how those methodologies are mapping onto our conceptual work, the categories that Professor Limbert is mentioning, and the theoretical work that we're eventually developing coming from this kind of grounded research. And those are concerns that I continue to grapple with in anthropology, particularly because institutionally our work often requires that we work in this kind of individualistic way and do individual field work. And so I often just wanted more collaborative research. And I was, I wanted other people to be there with me, thinking about my question, but maybe working at it from different angles. And all of us could be collaborating together to understand what it was that we were trying to build. So I continually am asking, what kind of toolkits do we need to do research on this theme in and out of South Asia, and the kind of spatialities that we're now becoming more concerned with, and also what kind of graduate training do we need to do this kind of research. And also what's exciting about thinking about this and reflecting on this now is that we do have all these new critical approaches to area studies that are more common in the Global North and Global South Academy. At UCI Anthropology, for example, we've been developing 2 research clusters speaking to these themes. One is called Interrogating South Asia Diasporas, and the other is called Global Africa, Global Blackness, and I can speak about those more a little bit later. For the papers today, I found out all the panelists were in some way critiquing the nation state form, and they were not interested in essentializing it or reproducing it as natural, but taking on the materiality of state power, state violence, and nationalist violence, and hegemonic knowledge formations that take the nation state form for granted, offering us a glimpse into alternatives, possible other universals, and moving into the directions of the otherwise through possible radical political projects or other kinds of spatial and temporal frames. The papers were also attentive to the ways in which imperialisms or sub-imperialisms, internal colonialisms, nationalisms, nativisms, racism, communalism, and heteropatriarchies are constantly being produced and reproduced, even with and despite the extraterritorial South Asian mobilities that they were tracing. So on the other side of mobility, we see immobility, carceral practices, communal and genocidal violence, interpersonal violence, and other kinds of aggressive projects. While some of the papers were more concerned with tracing the complexities of state power and the invented histories, ideologies, and discursive formations that constitute South Asian nationalisms and the racial, ethnic, religious, and casteist formations that undergird them. So in other words, they're concerned with enactments of power and hegemony and trying to understand them. Some of the other papers were concerned with tracing the circulation, labor, and ideas of elite intellectuals and political movements, quotidian acts of resistance to imperial and state violence, the everyday transgressive intimacies and friendships that emerge in contingent ways among discriminated and minoritized subjects, and even the political subjects or citizen subjects that are emerging with respect to these state and nationalist projects themselves. So in other words, there's so much that these papers give us to think about the nation state form and its critiques. Finally, the papers pointed to other temporalities, both past and future, and spatialities. We saw Indian Ocean circulations working from particular locations in the Indian Ocean, which is really important, like the Eastern Indian Ocean. The suspect and surveilled frontier and peripheral regions of nation states such as in contemporary Pakistan, and the emergent brown commons in urban New Delhi in India, which I thought was really fascinating. So one guiding question for our discussion and for the theme of critiquing the nation state is one that I think is also an ethical project for all of us these days, especially, is how do we remain both inside and outside of the nation state form simultaneously? How can we be attentive to the construction of nationalism and state violence, but also continually work towards their dismantling? And I think we have to be attentive to both of those, right, in some way. And I say that because in some of my other work, in which I'm thinking about this turn to transregional study in the Indian Ocean, I've noticed that it often means that we can romanticize sort of post-national possibility, especially cosmopolitanisms and interracial and cultural exchange, often at the expense of examining how these broader transregional circulations can also be linked up with very conservative or regressive intellectual and political projects, enforcement of borders, the reconstitution of community boundaries, racial, caste, class, religious differences and hierarchies, racial capitalism and anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness, and other kinds of communal, gendered, homophobic, queer, trans violence. Certainly we see that with transnational Hindutva, and we definitely need more work on that in some of these Indian Ocean, Global South spaces that we've been talking about. And in my own work, I've been exploring the late capitalist, patriarchal and authoritarian co-optations of histories of Afro-Asian connection and solidarity in the Global South arena, especially with the geopolitics of South-South connection. South-South cooperation. So it doesn't mean that these projects are necessarily always radical or emancipatory, but they can be regressive as well. And then I think a second guiding question, and then I'll wrap up soon after, is that while the conference thematics focus a lot on race, caste, and ethnicity, for example, in the description of in and out of South Asia, we know that gender and sexuality are also central categories of research analysis and social practice. And we know that gender and sexuality are also constitutive of domains of race, caste, ethnicity, and religion. There's so much that we can learn from some of the earlier discussions on gender and nationalism in South Asia, and builds on the work that South Asian post-colonial feminists, intersectional feminists, and transnational feminists, especially in the Global South, have done and are doing to refine our projects, our methodologies, our research questions that we're asking, and strengthening our feminist toolkits to do this kind of work is really, really essential. So a guiding question that I have is, what can feminist and queer methodologies and epistemologies bring to the table in terms of thinking about in and out of South Asia? So beyond thinking about the conventional units of analysis that we deploy, like the nation state, diasporic community, and the transnational, our turn to trans-regional spatialities like frontier regions, intra-Asia, Indian Ocean, Africa-Asia, South-South cooperation, et cetera, also entail this kind of feminist analysis. And I'll be happy to talk further on later on about my book project, but the project that I'm finishing now is called Insecurities of Expulsion, Race, Violence, Citizenship, and Afro-Asian Entanglements in Trans-Regional Uganda. And my attention in this book is to the ways in which racially nativist nationalism and a post-liberal democratic norm of South Asian non-citizenship in contemporary Uganda is being formed through the 1972 Asian expulsion, the repatriation of Ugandan Asian exiles from the global north, and also new South-South migrations from post-partition, post-colonial India and Pakistan. In the book, I'm resituating the expulsion as a global critical event, signaling a kind of trans-regional geography that's important to understand for these exiles. And I'm developing this concept called Insecurities of Expulsion to map the unresolved nature of the expulsion, its effects and its affects. And in doing so, I'm developing an anthropology of Afro-Asian entanglements that can span the global North and South, which actually then allows us possibilities for thinking about, for example, what are the possibilities and limits of our conceptual categories and theoretical frameworks that we're using, like anti-Blackness, to what extent can it stretch to some of these places? Anti-Black racism, which comes from the radical Black tradition, but also keeps space open for things like Afro-Asian liberation and Afro-Asian solidarity, right? Racial capitalism, et cetera, and other categories and theories. And I'm also deploying feminist methodologies and feminist analysis in this book. And that, I feel, allowed me to sort of make some of these theories and concepts more available and accessible, and to actually be able to do my own concept work in the book as well. And I can talk a little bit more about that. So I know that we have to keep going, so I'll end right there. But thanks so much for inviting me again.
Thank you so much, Professor Hundle, for that, and to Professor Limbert as well, because I suppose, yeah, these comments are really helpful in kind of guiding our discussion, particularly in thinking with, but also beyond the containers of the nation state, and considering both the violence and the potential for solidarities that these concepts and these labels and these ways of thinking about nation states really bring about. And so without further ado, we will now move to panelists' very brief summaries of their presentations of their papers, around 5 minutes or less, to just provide an overview to everyone in this room, folks who may not have had a chance to look through the Dropbox submissions, or just to, to provide a refresher. So we could begin with Kelvin. That would be wonderful. And then we'll proceed from there in the order of the presentations on the website.
Of course. Thank you so much, Irene, for the introduction. And thank you to both professors for really generously agreeing to comment on our papers. And thank you all for joining us tonight in this conference. It's almost 9 p.m. here where I'm at. So I'm really sort of honored that you all are choosing to spend your Saturday nights at this conference. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see it? All right, perfect. So this paper that I presented for this conference is really it's one chapter of my dissertation project, which looks at different forms of different ideas of political equality that circulated around the Eastern Indian Ocean, specifically between South Asia and Southeast Asia in the interwar years. And so this chapter really takes up anti-caste radicalism as one important strand of political thinking that importantly structured how many thinkers were sort of structuring their political projects. The other chapters deal with other sort of strands of political thinking, such as communist internationalism and pan-Islamism as two equivalent sort of like equally powerful universalizing and universalist ideologies that guided many sort of political activists and mobilized many social groups into political action. But this chapter really attempts to sort of think about the self-respect movement, which is an anti-caste, anti-Brahminical movement that originated in the Madras presidency as part of this broader Indian Ocean story. And it argues that the conditions of possibility for the self-respect movement to launch an anti-caste critique was very much linked to certain transformations in colonial political economy. So this is a photo, for instance, of Periyar, who is widely regarded as one of the pioneers of the self-respect movement with Dr. Ambedkar and Jinnah in 1940. But I'm really sort of addressing an earlier moment than that. And I make three interrelated arguments in this presentation. First being that equality was established as a central problematic of the political among self-respecters across both sides of the Bay of Bengal. So between Madras presidency and Millia, equality in terms of class and caste was held as the primary issue that most of these self-respecters were agitating to it. Secondly, that labor formed the grounds for a principle of reciprocal equity in social relation. So in British Malaya especially, you witness that a lot of these claims towards abolishing the caste system crucially turn around questions of labor and questions of labor mobilization. In particular, labor became the central political grounds upon which claims towards equality could be made, because the idea here was that labor entitled many of these figures a claim over the products of the labor and a claim to within this realm of the political. And the third argument here is that the spatial scale for the self-respect movement and for thinking anti-caste radicalism more broadly is global and it's geographically dispersed. Conference is that we've sort of disambiguated the category of mobility in important ways, and we've sort of talked about different scales at which mobility may be disaggregated, and that labor migrants and business like traders and refugees may not fall under the same category of mobility. And I think that that's important critique that I will certainly take to heart. But at the core of my argument here is that really this sort of mobility across the Bay of Bengal that's at this historical moment circular and not settled, really structured the conditions for the self-respecters in British Malaya to think of themselves as political actors with a certain commitment towards political reform on the Indian subcontinent. So some of the sources that I've used in this presentation include Tamil newspapers that were published in British Malaya, specifically the Tamil Mason and the Tamil Murasu that were both published in, the former is published in Kuala Lumpur and the latter is published in Singapore. And the latter, Tamil Murasu, is really the one that really picks up on many of these questions of self-respect. So Periyar is a really interesting figure, and he's one of the figures that I'm going to sort of address a bit more in an expanded version of this chapter for my dissertation, hopefully. And he really has this massive impact on self-respecters in Singapore, chief among them being G. Sarangapani, who was the chief editor of the Tamil Murasu and who formulated really strident critiques of the caste system. And many of his critiques were sort of reflecting on how the conditions of labor in the plantation spaces of British Malaya really occasioned a sort of radical challenge to its forms in which caste came to be manifest through space. So for instance, segregated housing, or the lack of availability of common dining facilities, or just different entitlements and privileges that are attached to labor union membership. So many of his articles in these newspapers came to crucially reflect on those issues. And here's a photo of Periyar and Sarangapani together in Singapore in 1954 upon Periyar's second visit to Singapore. So ultimately, I think that my broader argument here is to sort of argue that the history of anti-caste radicalism in India, and specifically in South India, has to be routed through this sort of geographically dispersed sort of problem space in order to fully appreciate some of the conditions of its emergence and political claims. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that, Kelvin. Yeah, it's really generative. We'll now move to Darakhsha Qamar's paper. So just a brief 5-minute kind of summary of what your presentation hopes to offer us.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to finally thank Irene and Anisha, who I've been corresponding with throughout and who I did not thank in my presentation despite having uploaded it twice, but that's just how it is. But thank you so much for being so supportive and organizing this. My presentation is Aryan theory and South Asia and the role of race in the development of cultural and ethnic nationalism in India and Sri Lanka in the 19th century. A very brief summary of that would be that I basically introduced the Aryan theory as part of the Orientalist project of producing knowledge about the colonies. And the Aryan theory was to aid the scholars in the colonies in rediscovering their past and proved to be hugely influential to the indigenous intelligentsia who were looking to the past in order to develop an identity and to legitimize that identity. And I basically limited to looking at the cases of India and Sri Lanka. In India, the 19th century reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Diana and Saraswati, and later on went on to inform the works of V. Savarkar, one of the main ideologues of the Hindu nationalist movement, were deeply influenced by the Aryan theory. Went about developing a new Hindu identity that was befitting the descendants of the great Aryan race. This identity, however, soon got conflated into the nationalist identity. It was a kind of cultural nationalism that took its cues from the Aryan theory. It was inherently exclusivist in nature as well as gender and casteist. According to this parochial nationalism, founded on the principle of Hindu majoritarianism, Muslims and lower caste Hindus did not qualify to be Indians at all, since they weren't descendants of the ancient Aryan race. In line with Aryan values, these cultural nationalists sought to redefine what real manhood and womanhood looked like. This made way for the creation of a masculine nationalist identity that glorified conquest, courage, valor, as well as spirituality, as opposed to weakness, laziness, effeminacy. This I must clarify, which I didn't in my presentation, is in the context of a patriarchal society where there exists a gendered social structure and certain characteristics which are attributed to be masculine characteristics are valued above certain feminine characteristics. This is not to say that only men possess these characteristics, or only women possess these categories or these characteristics. So anybody who doesn't identify as either or both cannot or can have these categories. These are just constructions, as is the case as is often the case with a binary worldview looking at gender and sex. Now, a similar process was underway across the Park Strait in the country then known as Ceylon, today it was Sri Lanka. In the 19th century, in an attempt to counter the imposition of the imperial culture, the majority ethnic community of the Sinhalese started a cultural revival of sorts, project that drew credence from the Aryan theory as well. Similar to the Indian counterparts, the major proponents of this project, like the educationist Anagarika Dharmapala, sought to create the vision of a golden Sinhala past. And this involved the propagation of the myth that the Sinhalas were actually descendants of the Aryans from North India, the chosen people who were tasked with the responsibility of protecting Buddhism. This not only proved their uniqueness as special chosen group of people, it also distanced them racially from the Dravidian Tamils who served as the other in the creation of the hallowed Sinhala Buddhi ethnic nationalist identity. My main argument is what I mainly sought out to do is to explore at length the different ways that the Aryan nation ideology influenced the development of these exclusionary nationalisms in both these countries and rendered invisible the lives of the minorities and the story of the creation of the nation. In doing so, I also hope to establish a link between these racist nationalism and the intense polarization, the increasing marginalization of minorities that are prevalent in these countries today. Another thing that I must clarify is that I use in this paper several times the word ethnic nationalism to refer to Sri Lanka, and cultural nationalism to refer to the Indian model. However, I haven't really justified it or really said why do I use it. So I think here would be a good opportunity for me to explain that further. So I call Sri Lanka an ethno-national state, as well as many scholars, I'm not the first to have done it, is because in an ethno-national state, a dominant ethnicity or ethnic ties are considered to be the most important factor in the development of the nationalist identity. It's based on one ethnic identity that over time becomes the most dominant one. Cultural nationalism is a kind of nationalism that binds people together as a nation on the basis of shared cultural ties. Now, culture is, of course, a very broad term, so lends itself to several competing interpretations. But the dominant cultural narrative that does come to prevail is a result of recognizing certain aspects as part of the culture while rendering other aspects invisible. The dominant form of cultural nationalism in India is that of Hindu nationalism, at the root of which is the Hindu supremacist ideology of Hindutva that seeks to conflate the Indian identity with the Hindu identity. Thank you very much. That was.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Darakhsha. Arshad, so if you could just offer us a brief summary of your work as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Irene. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for this wonderful opportunity. Before I summarize my paper, I would like to contextualize it within my larger PhD project that it is a part of. I'm writing my dissertation on the cultural representations of Hijra identity in novels, films, and life writing, where I argue that the Hijra community has long been understood through certain dominant ideas, like the colonists define them as a criminal tribe that traffics children and castrates them. In my PhD project, I also argue that, I argue that the contemporary Hijra narratives not only speak back to such claims, but also construct the Hijra subject through enactments of national belonging, practices of citizenship, and negotiations with certain ideologies of Indian nationalism. In this paper, I examined 3 texts that represent Hijra acts of community building outside the traditional gharana or household, which is perceived to be the primary locus of Hijra identity. These texts include Mona Ahmed and Dayanita Singh's life narrative, Myself, Mona Ahmed, Arundhati Roy's novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and Khushwant Singh's Delhi, a novel. Through these works, I've attempted to read the formations of fractured and ephemeral relationships and intimacies between Hijra and cisgender characters and persons within liminal as well as privileged spaces of Delhi. I read their relationships as encounters that may signal newer political possibilities. I consider the representations of an emergent Hijra commons one that is not perhaps revolutionary, but may exemplify moments of refusal and dissent that can also be considered interruptive of social hierarchies and forms of segregation. I take Jose Esteban Munoz's idea of brown commons as a point of departure to suggest that perhaps a Hijra commons would be a similar construction in that it demonstrates participation, movement, and a situatedness that may not allow for a concrete and stable community to form, but generate imperfect contextual belongings. I locate such possibilities in both Roy's and Ahmed's narratives that talk about Hijra life in a Muslim graveyard. In both narratives, a Muslim Hijra figure who is a failure and who is doubly alienated from her community as well as society finds refuge in her ancestral graveyard that comes with its own history of traumas and even resistances. I couldn't get into a more expansive analysis of Ahmed's story here, but I find that it demonstrates patterns of class and religious conflicts, as well as occasions of friendship that give it a precarious structure where people from all walks of life go in and out as they please. Roy's novel, which is partially based on Ahmed's life narrative, provides the history of Old Delhi's Muslim Hijra communities that once derived their sense of stability from the tradition of the Gharana, as well as the heritage of having been an important part of the Mughal Empire. However, the more recent and cumulative histories of communal violence and Islamophobia disrupt that stability and become a part of their identity as Muslim Hijras living in a ghettoized neighborhood like Turkman Gate. More specifically, Roy's Hijra character Anjum and a cis male Dalit character named Saddam Hussein are equally traumatized by Hindu nationalist lynch mobs, and their sense of guilt of having been complicit in the same violence that they were also victims of binds them to the graveyard as a shared space for anybody and everybody. Moving on to Khushwant Singh's novel, Delhi, I note how Lutyen's Delhi is a segregated space for the elite, where Singh's privileges are suspended during the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom, and he's reduced to bare life. In this scenario, it is his marginalized Hijra lover and friend Bhagmati who comes to protect and rescue him. There are 2 significant details here. 1, Singh identifies Bhagmati as the very city of Delhi, grotesque yet alluring in an exotic way. 2, Bhagmati's mobility as a Hijra allows her to traverse a riot-stricken city in a way that he cannot, and he is also forced to confront his own minoritarian status. This reversal leads me to follow Leela Gandhi's question: how do we understand the capacity for radical kinship, even if this gesture of reaching out to the others does not provide resolutions? In the conclusion, I instead consider what this capacity represents in the Hijra context. Perhaps these crossings and intimacies become transgressive because they pose a challenge to how Hijras are imagined as a group. By exceeding the boundaries of the Gharana, they also break the boundaries of heteronorm that earns its stability from its other. They also reconfigure not only liminal spaces like the Muslim graveyard, but also destabilize spaces of privilege like Lutyen's Delhi, regardless of the suspension of norms. Overall, Hijra acts of community building and even situational solidarities force a reevaluation of public and private spaces that continuously generates social ephemera. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Arshad. Thank you. And finally, before we proceed to faculty discussion comments, I invite Sonia Qadir to offer us a brief summary again of your paper.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing the conference. I'm just going to try and see if I can share my screen. Okay, so this paper that I'm presenting is based on some sort of preliminary work that I'm doing for my PhD, and just to, before I begin, just to give a sense of like the reason I've been interested in this project was really to try and understand how Pakistan as sort of a frontline state on the war on terror has what was going on within the country. And because I think a lot of the sort of the literature that's come out on the war on terror, and especially sort of that focuses on the legal aspects of the war on terror, really does not talk about Muslim majority context, and it reads Pakistan in very specific, particular ways in terms of a rogue state, but the actual things that happen within the country and in terms of the way the law is being deployed is not really sort of being looked at. So that was sort of I think the reason why I was interested in this project in general. So we'll just move into the main arguments of my, sorry, just give me a second. If I can you guys see the slides? Okay, so basically the reason for the main arguments that I'm making in my presentation are that there's a sense of fear and suspicion through which the Pakistani state and sort of the post-colonial state is really looking at the frontiers of the state, and some of that has to do with the ways in which there are cross-border ties between sort of people that live in these regions are kind of transcending the nation state's borders specifically, but also it has to do with a lot of longer genealogies that are of these regions particularly. A lot of the suspicion has also sort of become much more heightened during the war on terror, now that the state has both sort of like these narratives as well as legal resources and other kinds of resources at its disposal to be able to sort of police the communities from these regions a lot more than before. So what this kind of leads to is that there's a control of mobility as a key objective of the post-colonial state in this particular, especially under the war on terror. So in addition to sort of physical infrastructure, so some of the literature that has existed on this on this topic talks about the physical infrastructures that have been securitized, like the presence of a lot of checkposts that has become really like prevalent in Pakistan or under the war on terror. But in addition to physical infrastructures, as well as sort of extrajudicial measures like enforced disappearances, I'm arguing that there's actually a lot of a use of the legal technology specifically as well to be able to manage mobility. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly talk about the two field sites that I'm looking at. So one of them is the Pashtun communities from the tribal regions. This is the northwest of Pakistan. And these regions, specifically the area that used to be called the federally administered tribal areas, this has really been the theater of war under sort of the global war on terror, right? And what has happened is because there was a lot of, there was a military sort of operations here, as well as drone attacks, etc. So a lot of the population from this region has had to migrate to other places. And there's also a lot of historical sort of legacies, colonial genealogies associated with the sort of the way the state treats people from this region. So as well as the fact that the very border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which was drawn by the British Empire, is also has been a source of constant conflict between these between the two countries, and also a great deal of sort of anxiety for the Pakistani state as well about the people from this region. So post the war on terror, the height of the war on terror, there's a movement that comes out of this region, which is called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, or PTM for short. And it is really challenging the state's narrative about this region, but also sort of trying to hold the state accountable for what they've done under these military operations in this region. And that kind of leads to a further form of sort of like, anxiety about the people and the activists from this region. The second side that I'm talking about is the northern frontier of Pakistan, and this is what's called the Gilgit-Baltistan region. And this region also has never actually become part of Pakistan constitutionally, because Pakistan continues to see it as part of the Kashmir dispute, just like with India. So it is the way it has been managed or administered by Pakistan is in a very ad hoc manner. They've used various different laws and presidential ordinances to do that. And it has caused a lot of sort of, grief and a sense of marginalization for the people from this region. And increasingly, because of this particular constitutional issue, its geopolitical importance, its sort of disputed status, the fact that this is a Shia majority region in a Sunni majority country, but also more recently because of its importance in what is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which will go through this particular region. There's again a heightened sense of sort of anxiety about this region when it comes to the post-colonial security state. So my argument essentially is that there are a number of legal technologies that the state is sort of, using to be able to sort of control and police the mobility of the people of these regions because of the sense of anxiety and suspicion that it feels for the people from this region. So these are not just extrajudicial measures, as I said, but there are multiple laws and sort of legal technologies that are together kind of forming an assemblage. And the three technologies that I talk about in my paper, one of them is called listing, so just making lists. The other is administrative orders, and the third is the police registry, and I'll just briefly talk about all of them. One of the first ones that I'm looking at in my paper is what is the terrorism watch list. This is Pakistan's primary terrorism watch list. It's called the Schedule 4 of the Anti-Terrorism Act, 1997. And while it's being used all across the country, it's really being, I think its largest use has been in Gilgit-Baltistan. So almost all during my interviews, during my fieldwork, pretty much all the activists I would meet, some people there would have been on that list or maybe had been previously on this list. And these are mostly progressive activists, often socialists, etc. So these are not, they don't have anything to do with what we consider quote unquote terrorism, etc. Okay, so what happens if you're on the list is that there are a lot of different kinds of restrictions placed on you, and this includes restrictions on your mobility. So you cannot, for instance, you may not be allowed to go into public spaces like parks or schools, etc. Your ID cards are blocked, your bank accounts are blocked, and also if you try to move from a place to another, you'll be constantly harassed by the police. Okay, so the second list that I'm talking about or looking at is the no-fly list. In Pakistan, this is called the Exit Control List, which is maintained under the Exit from Pakistan Control Ordinance 1981. So this obviously precedes the war on terror specifically, and it's been used throughout since it was made. It's been used against political opponents by any sitting government. But in the context of the war on terror, I think one of the main uses of it has been to sort of try to control the mobility of Pashtun activists, specifically belonging to PTM. And it's not made public. So this is a very specific thing about this list. It's not available publicly, and people really don't know if they're on it. And the only way they can find out is if they literally buy a ticket and try to board a plane. But it's used so often that a lot of young activists are pretty much that they assume that they're kind of on it, but it creates a lot of like apprehension and fear, especially these young people who are maybe trying to go abroad to study, if they can actually do that. So it's really been used in a way to I think for economic as well as educational mobility, it's been tried to stop that for these young activists. So the second kind of legal technology that I'm looking at is administrative orders. And these are orders that are going to be given by the provincial or the district authorities. Mostly they're being done under this ordinance called the Maintenance of Public Order Ordinance 1960 in the section 5 of it. And what this ordinance did was it was made, this was passed under the government of Ayub Khan, who was a military dictator. And it really gives a lot of discretion to provincial or district authorities to take any kind of action against people that they suspect. So for instance, they can tell them to like not enter a place or remain in a place or not reside in a particular place or specifically only reside in one specific place. So there's a lot of different things that they can do with it. It has been really used in the context again of my research that I've seen it being used is again against most of the main leaders of the Pashtun Tahafuz movement or the PTM. And what they do is that there will be an order from the provincial government or the district authorities to say that their leaders cannot enter either a particular district or an entire province. Sometimes it's usually used to say ensure that a rally or a protest cannot happen. The last one that the last technique that I'm looking at is what I'm calling a police registry. This is basically an act called Information of Temporary Residence Act 2015, which has been passed by all provinces, but I'm looking at it specifically in the Punjab region. And this came about because of National Action Plan, which is a policy made by Pakistan to sort of deal with terrorism in 2015. And before that, the data for people who are tenants who are moving into a city and just sort of leasing a place or and are just staying on rent at a place, this was being collected already, but under this particular act now the police is involved and they're supposed to collect like data which will then go into forming a centralized database. And again, from what I've seen, what is really being used against, specifically in Punjab, was against Pashtun migrants. And this is again in the context of the aftermath of the war on terror. And a lot of these people are moving in from former Fatah, which has, because of military operations. So these are often working class migrants who are moving into sort of cities across Pakistan, and it's being used very specifically against them to sort of regulate their mobility within the city in which they're living in. Because if they're found in place A and the police will be like, why are you here? Show us your ID card, where you and your registration cards, etc. So I think just to conclude very quickly, I think there are loads of all these different technologies have been used in Pakistan, and I think it's interesting to see that it is not just either extrajudicial measures or specifically physical infrastructures that are being used, but a lot of these laws are also very specifically being used and in interesting ways to form a kind of an edifice of a regulation around it. And as well as the fact that some of these laws are very specifically related to counterterrorism measures and others are not, and others are much more sort of ordinary laws that are being utilized. So yes, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia. We will now move to faculty discussion comments on all of these papers. And I'm not sure, again, if Professor Limbert or Professor Hundle, who would like to go first? Would you? I see that you have your microphone.
I'll just start. Should I just start?
Yes.
Okay. And first of all, can everyone just call me Mandana? This Professor Limbert thing is making me feel funny. Anyway, so just Mandana, please. Okay. So I'm gonna just say just one narrow thing about the papers in general, and then shoot some specific questions to each of the papers, and hopefully it'll be helpful. Obviously, these were all excellent papers, and like I said earlier, it was really when I was reading these and following the other panels that it came home to me how frustrating it is not to attend to the vast complexity of the world, the Western Indian Ocean world, that I wish I could. So these 4 papers are clearly from different disciplines, history and anthropology and English, and focus on quite distinct topics, periods and scales. And yet there are themes clearly that overlap, as I know we'll talk about. And each paper, of course, raises rich questions on its own right. As I read, I couldn't help noticing and wondering whether what the conversation would look like if we shifted our gaze just a little bit and asked less about the mobilities per se and immobilities, though it's there, of course, and more about the formation or protection of borders as a panel, both in the jurisdictional or territorial mode and in terms of the sex, class, and racialized subjects. While certainly, as was outlined at the very beginning of the conference, the tensions between mobility and immobility outside of an orientation to Europe is one of the driving themes here. I couldn't help wondering whether, as we're thinking of this mobility, the question of borders itself becomes helpful, especially as these borders are sometimes rigid and sometimes malleable. Sometimes territorial borders are spatially relative or as proximity or identities, as evident too in Kelvin's paper. Perhaps we don't need to stick so closely to critiquing the nation state, but perhaps we can think too specifically about how these papers in fact do that. Is it by exposing its violence or the vagaries of identity politics or the edifices, or of the kinds of borders and when and how they are erected or not? So I'm going to go through a series of questions for each paper, and I'm going to do them in the order that I read them. So apologies there. So I read Sonia's paper first, so I'm just going to start with yours. So in examining the legal security state in Pakistan, in particular the technologies of surveillance, which was wonderfully outlined on its own, I just had some questions. In the opening page, we're told that it is fear and suspicion that is driving the increased regulations and restrictions. I can't help wondering whether it's possible to delimit this sentiment so precisely. I understand within the context of the war on terror, fear and suspicion stand out, but I can't help also wondering whether imputing motive is as significant here as the effects that you're outlining itself. So I was just wondering what was at stake in imputing the motive rather than focusing on their effects. Given that there's a long history of controls and border controls and mobility controls, I again wondered how the current moment of the war on terror shifted the long history and legacy of fear of the frontier, if indeed there is fear. I couldn't help too whether the work, for example, on Israel-Palestine, Hagar Kotev's work, Juliana Ott's work on suspicion might be helpful. As for the technologies from the lists and schedules to the administrative orders, I found that fascinating, really incredible. And I wanted to hear more. Lists are objectify and finalize, but clearly, as you also note, there's an imaginary side that itself also evokes fear. Am I on a list? How do I control the lists that exist? What if I ask, might I suddenly be put on one, right? As one of your interviewees noted. Thus, the secret list is not known, but then might be known. Then there is the laugh on page 6, a very nervous laugh, it seems to me. So I was just, the lists are there, but your ethnographic richness around the lists have as much to do with not knowing what's on the lists, the sensitivity to the lists, rather than the actual lists itself. And so I was curious if we could talk about that more. It was really beautiful. As for the administrative orders, where we see in part, again, some tensions. There's the judicial tension, the discretionary powers being doled out, but they need to be done in a legal way. So always the tensions of the discretionary legal world. So I thought that was fascinating. Darakhsha. So here my questions are much broader, and perhaps it's not possible to narrow the lens, but perhaps the analytic labels that are entwined here could be teased out more. or you can help us walk through the relationships. It was great. It was really helpful hearing you speak it. So I could sort of follow the thread. As presented here, we understand that racism is the foundation, at least in the paper, that's what I understood. Racism is the foundation that structures the nationalism, both religious and ethnic. Is that right? That's how I read the paper. And this racism, as is being traced here, identified specifically as theories of Aryanism, as linguistic and racial, and then taken up by nationalist and revivalist elites in India and in Sri Lanka. In line with some of the comments yesterday, could we consider a situation where the account is not quite as narrow to this singular origin? Or what do you think might get lost with this singular focus? I mean, I'm sure there is a lot more that one could bring into it, and I'm curious what you felt like you had to bracket, if you did at all, in closing in. Clearly, the language politics here appear quite different in the context of Kelvin's paper, and it would be curious to hear the two of you sort of talk it out a little bit, because I thought there was a really interesting overlap over Tamil. Anyway, I thought that was really interesting. Arshad, this is a fascinating, interesting analysis of the Hijra commons and not assemblage, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that in several novels spanning from 1990 to 2017. I also had a series of questions for you, and apologies, these aren't in any particular order. I was struck about how security here was a security of comfort in your paper, as opposed to the security of police and officers in Sonia's paper. Here you write, selves are loosened from the security and comfort. So it was an interesting resonance or disjuncture between ideas of security that both of you were tackling. I found fascinating the discussion of how killing a Hijra would bring bad luck, the power to curse, and perhaps even more ethnographically, the giggle. So now we have the giggle and the laugh that I wanted to sit with a little bit. The idea of crossing borders, exceeding boundaries, of breaking borders to reconfigure liminal spaces and destabilize the spaces of privilege, such that there is community building without across borders. On a larger scale, I couldn't help wondering, and perhaps this is a disciplinary question, about the historical context of both the writing of these novels and where they're set in time, right? The one book is from 1990, the next one is from 2017. That's clearly a large range. Can you sort of walk us through what might be different in terms of the historical context of those novels? And then as I started off, can you say a little bit more about the commons that you're speaking of? I thought that was really fascinating. And finally, Kelvin, this was really a wonderful paper tracing in many ways some of the newspaper wars, right? Jonathan Glassman writes of the newspaper wars of Zanzibar. These aren't quite the same, but it's definitely reminded me of the newspaper wars there. Among the Tamil diaspora in British Malaya, thinking, as Kelvin notes, outside the frames of memory, minority diaspora, or of localized contours of associational politics, instead looking rather to, quote, critical intellectual traditions in newspapers and how they articulate distinct and opposing positions, galvanizing around hierarchies and status that ultimately tore onto a pro and anti-Muslim politics. So I was curious really to hear a kind of methodological question that I have for you, because it's something that I struggle with too in terms of focusing on newspapers and newspapers as a genre. I mean, I thought it was amazing because it just reminded me of the circulation of documents that people are reading each other and responding to each other and excited to hear what each other has to say. But of course, it's a very contained, in some ways, genre. So I was curious methodologically how you are grappling with that. And that actually speaks to the next point, which is, as you raised, so much of the debate is about labor. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not about labor. I think it is about labor. But do you think that labor, in your own paper, you end with this discussion of marriage and sex, and clearly that those politics of identity as they manifest in terms of questions of marriage and sex are paramount. And I'm wondering whether these discussions of labor, they're not obscuring these other questions, but I was wondering, right? Is labor one way of speaking about equality, where who is marrying whom might not be something that people want to publicize, or tensions about that, but you can talk about labor. And that's the point of talking about it in the newspapers, and what happens when we sort of read the newspapers at face value, or can we read in between the lines of the newspaper? So that was, two big questions. I guess, oh yeah, and my last one was simply about, this particular period, this interwar period, is such a moment of flux, where so many of these categories and notions are getting sorted out. The passport is, getting implemented. The mobility is getting, reorganized. So I'm wondering about the sort of feeling of flux, that scene of mobility, that's the condition of possibility that you're describing, is also sort of global. So I will stop there, and thank you. Amazing papers.
Thank you so much for that, Mandana, for those incredibly generative comments. And I'm thinking we can perhaps go in the order of papers that you brought up, in the order that you read them. So perhaps if we start with Sonia first, and then we move on to Darakhsha, then Arshad, and then Kelvin.
Thank you so much, Mandana. This was really worthwhile to think about. I think your first question around fear and suspicion, I definitely need to think a little bit more about this, because this was essentially very preliminary kind of, observations, and I'm just starting to think about how to make sense of what I'm seeing in the field. I think there is, because in terms of the way people talk about their experiences as well, and the fact that there is a sort of longer history around how the state has been worried or has shown and there's also the people that are involved in these regions, because they often talk about whether they belong in this nation state or not, and the fact that they have ties, kinship ties, often across borders. There is, and there is literature in Pakistan around the fact that this sort of causes a kind of suspicion for the motives, the loyalty of the people from this region. So it's in some ways that, in those ways that I'm sort of talking about it, but also I think when you see in the field today how the state sort of constantly worries, is almost paranoid about what are these people doing, or what are they thinking, or why are they doing this? Which, even over very, very small things, which makes you which sort of leads me to think that there is a sort of lens of suspicion or fear that they're doing it. But you're definitely right. I have to think a little bit more about what how to imagine that, and why I should be using it. Israel, the work on Israel and Palestine, absolutely. I think I definitely need to engage with it, and I'm going to be doing it as I sort of sit back and finish my fieldwork and sit down and start thinking about theorizing things. In terms of, yes, the not knowing what's on the list, as well as it is, so definitely, I think, especially with the no-fly list, there was definitely a lot of that kind of confusion over what does that mean, and I think I need to flesh that out a little bit more. And yeah, so I think that the last point about that this is very discretionary, but yet the law is being employed, is kind of speaks to the larger question that I think looking at, is how, even though the state, and it's mostly been, the literature that exists has been critiquing the extrajudicial migrants, which they've used a lot of. There's also ways in which they're deploying and almost maybe being forced to use the law itself, but in some ways in very illegal ways as well. So it's really interesting how that is kind of playing out. But thank you. I will be thinking much more about these lines.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Perhaps now we can move to Darakhsha, if you'd like to respond to Mandana's comments and questions.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Would it be, you're
Can you
not,
not hear me?
yeah.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your comments, and I'm so grateful that you decided to read my paper. But I think the problem is that because of the paucity of, I think, space, I couldn't express. I'm so sorry for the background noise, but that's just Delhi. And because of the paucity of the space, I couldn't really explain, I think, the analytical lens that I was using. And I perhaps didn't want to, because I didn't really think that was what I was getting at, the narrative that I was sort of creating. But it's more apparent in my presentation, I hope. I'd also like to contextualize this within the larger topic of my thesis. I'm doing a PhD on gender nationalism in post-colonial South Asia. So the lens of analysis that I use is often gendered, and has been so by default for this paper as well. So I'd like to combine, I hope, like the two of your questions to say that my main argument, I think, whether irrespective of whether it came out or not, I mean, is that a gendered nationalist project is a gendered project, and to say that is not only to explore the position of women in the creation of nationalist identity, but also to expose how masculine it is, and with what that entails. When from whatever I have read from scholars who worked on gender and nationalism, it creates for a very exclusivist kind of nationalism, one that does not allow for ultimately the relationship between us and them, which is so central to the idea of creation of nationalist identities, gendered in nature. So the other is always attributed characteristics that are typically associated with the feminine, and we attribute ourselves with the masculine characteristics. And this is what really I connected with the Aryan race theory. And this is also why I use the term hegemonic masculinity to define, to describe how the Indian manhood was redefined, and that also played a role in how Indian womanhood was defined. As far as the Aryan race theory influencing these exclusivist nationalisms, yes, I mean, of course, it's a very narrow way that I've looked at it, because this is actually the first time that I actually looked at it from the point of view of race, which was very enriching for me. But mainly the fact that we allow a racial theory, a theory of racial superiority, to be the basis of our nationalist identity is in itself indicative of the gender project that nationalism is and continues to be in India. Another thing that you said about the borders, I think, I mean, I don't remember, but I think you just said it in general. I'm from the northeastern part of India. I'm from Assam. So our borders have always been very porous, as has been the case with most of South
Darakhsha?
colonial administration. Sorry, am I taking more time than
I just said we had lost you.
My connection is unstable. Well, okay. So, I mean, I don't know where anyway. So our borders are extremely porous, and they always have been. And because of the colonial administration's attempt to make sense of, the communities, the different linguistic, ethnic communities, and in order to geographically make sense of them for ease of administration, those colonial borders were drawn, and they remain till date. There hasn't been much change. Whatever internal restructuring we've managed have often been termed as insurgency, and have often been termed as, like ethno-nationalist movements, which, I mean, of course, that's another argument. There are sub-nationalist tendencies, but the reason for them is because the reason for the existence of such sub-nationalist tendencies is because the larger nationalist identity cannot assimilate within itself, cannot include within itself the interests, the identity, and, the culture of the people at the margins, whether it be geographical, whether it be the geographical margins, whether it be, communal margins, but, at the margins. So, yeah, I mean, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
That's my opinion. Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you so much for that, Darakhsha. And Arshad, yeah.
So thank you, Mandana, for all the feedback and for all the questions. And there's a lot to cover there, especially to start with the historical context. I feel like I of course, never have enough space to talk about the context, but to sort of just take a quick overview. I start with Khushwant Singh's novel, published in 1990, is the oldest, and Khushwant Singh himself is taking a look at the history of Delhi and the way it has been invaded and rebuilt over and over again, and that's how he sees his Hijra lover and protagonist of his novel. But this is also, of course, the time of, she is also living in close to the neighborhood of Turkman Gate and Lal Kuan, which is also, of course, witness to the emergency, the forced sterilizations, the raising of the ghettos, all of those violences. And of course, she herself is a victim of state violence, in that she is neglected and when he first meets her, he sees her having an epileptic attack while she's on her way home from the prison. Mona Ahmed, similarly, her life narrative was published in 2001 after about 10 years of the liberalization of the Indian economy. And in 1991, Serena Nanda published her landmark anthropological study on hijras called Neither Man Nor Women, that defined hijras for a very long time as based on the idea of hijras as the third sex. And hijras have been defined through those ideas over and over again, through different ideas, like the criminal tribe, like the third sex, or like in public health discourse defined as a vulnerable group, a group vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, defined through the contagion, defined as a target as a group for medical intervention in different ways. So all of those sort of definitions have snowballed over time, and of course with the beginning of the LGBT movement in India, and of course Hijra's marginal position within those movements starting in late 80s to early 90s. And of course, fast forward to Arundhati Roy's novel, where Arundhati Roy revitalizes Mona Ahmed's story, and of course imagines what a figure like Mona Ahmed would be like in contemporary situating her within Hindu nationalist resurgence and rather Hindu nationalist hegemony within the sort of within all of the violences like beef lynchings or anti-Dalit violences, all of those things happening while her character Anjum, who is based on Mona Ahmed, trying to find her space within the Muslim graveyard. So I think with all of these different characters in these different sort of places where, and I think this is the cliche, but the idea of Indian history of the history of the Indian subcontinent as a palimpsest, really works here because they're sort of piled up on top of each other, and they sort of form the background of how these Hijra characters and actual persons respond to certain situations. On the idea of now the idea of borders and crossing borders, and of course leaving and the security of comfort, I think all of those are also have been discussed in very different ways by certain scholars. So like and the anthropologist Gayatri Reddy, in her study on the Hijras of Hyderabad, called With Respect to Sex, she talks about something called what Hijras have an all India pass to be mobile across India, but not just, and it's a mobility it's a sort of a mixed privilege offered to Hijras because they are seen as figures who can curse you or bless you. So and of course also as an embarrassing social presence. So that mobility is sort of given to the Hijra community as a sort of a we leave you to your devices sort of a way, and that allows a certain kind of movement. And even Mona Ahmed in her life narrative writes that it doesn't matter if you're from Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, when there is a Hijra event, we all go regardless of the borders. So, and ethnographer, I believe Adnan Hussain from Bangladesh has written about something, what he defines as Hijra supranationality, where he talks about how the borders between India and Bangladesh are porous, but especially for Hijras, because their ability to move in and out of spaces is a sort of a given. So what's interesting in these narratives is that how the Hijra mobility plays out, defined by fear, defined by fears of being cursed, fears of being associated with Hijras, and how how the characters respond to them, but how it also is a source of trauma. So what I find is that, and here I connect this, and this may seem a little abstract, but I connect it to Jose Esteban Munoz's idea of the commons, because one of the ways in which he defines the commons is through as a sort of a conflict, as an opposition, especially given his example of Sylvia Rivera in 1979, where she's speaking back to a largely white cis gay and lesbian audience, telling them to think about, while they boo her down, telling them to think about the incarcerated and the sex workers and all those who are not included in the movement. And so Hijra Commons is oppositional by the very virtue of being present in public or private spaces. So I think Hijra presence itself is a disruptive presence. So I think the idea of commons sort of works well with the idea of Hijras disrupting borders. I don't know if that makes sense. It may be I may be sort of grappling at things here.
Thank you. I mean, you and Sonia, your projects, I feel like they're like these mirrors of each other. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Arshad. And finally, at least for this section, we'll have Kelvin.
Of course. Thank you, Mandana, again, for those really rich comments. I think I'll structure my response into the three sort of big questions that you had for me. But before that, I just want to give some sort of contextual remarks on some things that perhaps I had mentioned in my paper, but I didn't mention in my introductory sort of like comments, which one of which is the sort of role of language and how language really becomes politicized in the interwar years. And second is this sort of idea of the Dravidian that emerges with powerful force also around like the early 20th century. And I think that those provide a really serendipitous sort of like link with Darakhsha, your work. So first on language, so Tamil really becomes politicized in the early 20th century, and usually in the existing historiography that's somewhat linked to two sort of movements in South India. The first being the emergence of Neo-Shaivism, and the second being the emergence of the Dravidian movement. And so in my work, I sort of I want to cast this in like a broader sort of Indian Ocean context. And I think that there might be two different angles by which the politicization of Tamil might be sort of quite interestingly looked at. The first is the sort of the view from the anti-caste radicals, where the project of modernizing Tamil, or the project of sort of reforming Tamil, was really tied to sort of expelling words with Sanskrit roots that are associated with liturgical usage or upper caste usage. The second sort of like slice, which I didn't really get to go into in this paper, was really how a group of Tamil Muslims were thinking about the status of the Tamil language, and this was really sort of tied to the idea of which was the language that was most sort of appropriate or adequate to capturing capturing both a religious function as well as an everyday function. So this was a sort of debate that was conducted among many Tamil Muslims, and they were debating about the relative merits between like Tamil, Arabic, Arabi, which is Tamil written in the Arabic script, and Urdu, which was, or more accurately, Dakhni Urdu, which is the form of Urdu that's spoken in the Deccan. Secondly, on the Aryan Dravidian split, so I thank you so much, Darakhsha, for really problematizing and historicizing the emergence of this sort of division. In my own work, one thing that I've really sort of like observed is that this split comes to be invoked over and over and over again by many sort of anti-caste thinkers. Like if you think of the context of Western India, from Phule's Gulamgiri to Ambedkar's Who Are the Shudras, to many of these self-respect writings, this is a sort of like framework that emerges a lot in their work. And I'm really looking forward to having more sort of conversations with you, Darakhsha, on this really interesting work that you're doing. So on the three big questions, the first, perhaps methodological, I really appreciated your sort of connection of my work to Glassman's really classic War of Words, War of Stones. And I really draw inspiration from Glassman's sort of mapping of racial thinking and the sort of linguistic dimension to that, right? Where Swahili as a language becomes really a site for debate about how new ideas about Africanness versus Arabness come to play out in the press. And in terms of my own methodology, I acknowledge that, yeah, like on one hand, a newspaper is a very contained genre. And in my own sort of reading hermeneutics, I try to read both along and against the grain. So I supplement my reading of newspapers with a reading of colonial documents, where there's a tremendous amount of anxiety about the supposed sort of incendiary effects that these newspaper articles would pose. Many of these articles would describe a person like Periyar, for instance, as the white bearded prophet of Dravidistan. So I adopt that strategy to sort of like perhaps furbish a more complete view of social life. However, the other sort of part of my methodology that I didn't really get to go as much into in this paper would be to use visual materials that were produced in this period, especially visual materials around like photography and a lot of like artwork that were produced and collected by many of these anti-caste activists, as well as a massive oral history project that was undertaken in 1980 Singapore, where they had actually interviewed many of these former unionists or former sort of like members of these anti-caste political parties, and that are sort of, that present a sort of like really sort of rich archive of oral history. The second question on marriage and sex, and that is a question that I've been thinking a lot about just in terms of organizational structure. And I think that in the end, somewhere between submitting the paper and now, I had decided to sort of perhaps separate that out to a separate dissertation chapter, because it's like, I think that, there's so much richness to be said about self-respect marriages and how the terrain of genealogy and gender really become a site for political contestation as well. And here, I really draw inspiration from your work, Mandana. I remember that chapter from In the Time of Oil, where you talk about how genealogical histories really become the site for contesting ideas or the idea of the relationship between Oman and East Africa. And I think that in my own work, I observed that many of these marriages would eventually become a space for different imaginings of whether of like ideas of belonging, whether to British Malaya or to India. And these questions were questions that would emerge with incredible force entering into the 1940s as well. Because it's, when you have a child and when the child has to be given, a birth certificate and has to be registered with an official sort of like documentation, those questions of belonging obviously become sort of, they take on a certain symbolic valence in this context. The other sort of bit about gender that I find really interesting, however, is that many of the inspiration for marriage reform in the context of Tamil migrants in British Malaya were drawing inspiration from parallel movements among the Chinese community in British Malaya. And conversely, you have Chinese newspapers that were reflecting on self-respect marriages. And the translation of the word caste into Chinese was very sort of indeterminate because there was not a word for caste in Chinese. So some of them translated it as race, and some of them translated it as class, and some of them translated it as, you know, lineage or surname. So that was really interesting, and that I think that the advice is well taken. I'm going to sort of expand that into a chapter in its own right. The third question on the interwar period, it's also an incredibly astute question. And I think that there are two big things that happened during this period that I am really interested in. The first is the changing structures of mobility, where after the Great Depression, really, you find that mobility becomes curtailed. And in 1934, that's the first year where the out-migration of Indians from Malaya back to India exceeded the migration from India to Malaya. So there's a massive reversal of the directionality of migration. And I think that the Great Depression contributed a lot to, the Great Depression is also the first time where there are immigration quotas that are imposed, where the passport becomes an emergent technology governing, for instance, Chinese migration to Malaya. So there was obviously a sort of massive reorganization on the scale of bureaucracy and institutions. The second, however, is thinking about the interwar period, perhaps not as a Wilsonian moment, as Aris Manila would put it, but as a moment that witnessed the flourishing of other sort of political ideologies that were equally expansive and equally sort of anchored in something like what Adam Gatici would term will making, right? Alternative forms of will making. I don't think that this is a moment that could be reduced to a Leninist moment per se, but even if you were to look at a figure like Periyar, who is usually sort of read in this vein of an anti-caste thinker who's very local, very regional, and very particular to South India, his own itineraries are incredibly rich. He visits the Soviet Union in 1932, and his newspaper, the Kudi Arası, was like the first newspaper in the Tamil world to publish a translation of the Communist Manifesto. So Tamil was the second South Asian language into which the Communist Manifesto was translated, the first being Marathi. So really, I want to sort of think about the interwar period as perhaps a period of intellectual opening, where you find incredible, you know, various forms of imaginaries against empire, but they would not perhaps tethered to one single vision of what was to come after. But thank you again so much for Mandana. Your comments were so rich, and I really, really appreciate them.
Thank you so much for that, Kelvin. And so in the last 30 minutes of this panel, we'll now turn to Professor Anneeth Kaur Hundle, and after your discussion comments, we'll then move through the panelists' responses as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Irene. And likewise, you can call me Anneeth as well. We can drop the formalities at this point. And I know it's really late in some places where all of you are, so thanks for hanging in there. And I'll try to move through some of my comments quickly so we can continue the conversation. First of all, I just really loved all of these papers. They were just brilliant and so much fun to read. And I'm so excited about all the fascinating grad student work that is emerging. This is so exciting, and it was just a treat to be able to read them. And it was challenging reading across all the disciplines, but it's been a long time since I actually did that. And so I thank you for that intellectual work of reading work from a historian, from anthropologists, legal scholar, gender studies, literary studies, right? So that was really fun. I could also tell that all of you were in different stages of developing projects. So that was really interesting to see, and I could kind of guess where you all were at. But I try to frame my comments around the larger conference theme of in and out of South Asia. And so I'm trying to help with maybe expanding some strands of the work. So I'll start with the order of that was given to us in the program. Kelvin, I just loved this amazing, rich, complex history that you're offering us. It's such an impressive project. And I was actually wondering about your overall dissertation chapters, because I thought this paper itself was already, there was so much happening in it. I really had to like stop and pause and work through sections. And I still need to go through the full third long section of it because there's so much there. So I can imagine that it's just going to be really, really exciting when this finally all comes together. But I loved just learning all about this diasporic Tamil consciousness and this kind of region of the Indian Ocean between South India and the Malay migrations that are happening, and the self-respect movement that you're drawing out for us, which includes all these components of anti-casteism, gender equality, atheism, Dravidian revivalism. So there's so much richness even there in the kind of intellectual and political history that you're offering us. So in a way, I think what would be interesting is if you framed your project, and maybe you are in your intro, but within the larger Indian Ocean realm, like what exactly are your big interventions in bringing this particular regional Indian Ocean political and intellectual history to bear? And maybe you have some thoughts on that. You also use the phrase Indian Ocean intellectual life at some point, or Indian Ocean intellectual something. And I just found that really striking and was wondering if you were planning on playing with that a little bit more, and if you thought about contextualizing this project within the broader intellectual and political histories that are emerging. I know there's a lot emerging on religiosity and spirituality as a kind of, as forms of thought, right? Like in the Indian Ocean realm. And I'm wondering about just where you're placing this particular intellectual history that you're drawing out within all of that. I also had similar questions to Mandana about Indian Ocean methodology as a historian. And maybe I'm like reading this too much of an anthropology, but I was wondering, like, what does it mean to be a historian doing Indian Ocean work in the archives? And I wanted to know more about that. Like I wanted a methodology section to chew over. And I was kind of imagining you within different archives and wondering, like, what does it mean to shift to this Indian Ocean spatiality, like vis-a-vis your actual research methods? And what does that look like? And what does it mean to place yourself in your own research? And I don't know if that's too reflexive or subjective or too anthropological for where you want to go, but I just wanted to get a sense of your own like circulations within this geography. I think that would be very compelling to sort of draw out for us. And with the print press newspaper archive that you were working with, I was likewise wondering about what gets left out, right? So who are the subaltern figures that maybe can't be captured in the newspaper archives, like maybe illiterate working class people, women, queers, mixed race people, communities that maybe are like liminal and identifying as Tamil and Malay, or we're not really sure. But can that figure in somewhere in the larger project? Or do you have a place where you're thinking about the subaltern within this, right? And I think there were strands of that in the larger paper, but I wanted to know more about what gets bracketed out. And then finally, in the conclusion, you end with this kind of ambivalence against the idea that the end of British Empire and the emergence of the nation state system is a totalizing moment of closure to this kind of cosmopolitan public sphere, and the ideas and political movements that you're tracing in this Indian Ocean economy. And I found that really exciting in terms of thinking about what inheritances that we might have to work with. And the reason I say that is because oftentimes as an anthropologist, when I'm reading historical work on the Indian Ocean, it does sort of like end in this post-colonial closure where all this complexity gets reduced to like singularity of nation, race, culture, religion, whatever. And I always think like, okay, well, what do I do with this as an anthropologist? like, are there no inheritances to work with? So I'm wondering, like, where do you bracket this project's end, and what are the inheritances that maybe some of us in other fields can play with here, and how do you see them? So thank you so much. It was a great, great paper. So I'll move on to Darakhsha. Now, Darakhsha, thank you so much for your paper as well. So initially, I wasn't sure what discipline or field you were working in, but I thought maybe gender studies, and I think I was close. And I also got the sense that maybe you were in an early stage of working through this literature on race, caste, gender, and nationalism. And I was wondering if you are working through the scholarly discussion with respect to some kind of research project more broadly that you are conceptualizing at the moment, or if there are other kinds of case studies that you're looking at, possibly in the contemporary, or I'm not sure if you're working only in the historical era of these social reformers. So that was just a general question that I had. I really appreciated the way that you deployed this comparative method across India and Sri Lanka, and I really appreciated how you mapped Aryan linguistic and race theory with respect to the development of caste systems, and how you're thinking about it across religious communities as well. And in terms of ideas of purity and pollution, and otherness, foreignness, right? And the ways in which race is really undergirding what we call caste. And so that's so important. And I wanted to know more about the comparative method. So sort of highlighting to us, what are the stakes of the comparative method that you're using, like to what end? And why is it important to compare and contrast the Indian, I guess you said cultural nationalism with Sri Lankan ethnic nationalism, and why you highlight this particular approach as opposed to just working from like a singular territorial nationalist perspective? Why put those two together? What are you trying to accomplish with that? My other thought in terms of just thinking about the themes of this conference and kind of the critical turn in area studies and thinking critically about South Asia is that we know that India just occupies this very hegemonic position in South Asia. So what would it mean to kind of approach the debates on Aryan theory from a so-called peripheral region, even though it's not necessarily, but like, what if you centered Sri Lanka in this conversation? What would it reveal about the Indian scholarly discussion on race and caste that might be, there might be some assumptions or some exceptionalisms or some issues in that discussion that the Sri Lankan discussion could highlight or make legible for us. And I also think really thinking across the Hindu and Buddhist comparison is so important. So thinking with and across caste-based, but also so-called casteless religions, and the ways in which this Aryan racial theory and notions of purity and pollution, hierarchy, discrimination are working out in terms of insider, outsiders, indigenous versus foreign. In the Buddhist case is really interesting. So continuing to develop that, I think, is really exciting. And then you also mentioned towards the end that you mentioned contemporary communal violence in India, and you talk about the Karnataka violence against hijabi Indian or Muslim women, right, that happened recently. And so I was also thinking about, like, what are the other global racial formations that we need to be attentive to in contemporary India? So we know that this Islamophobia, right, or Islamo-racism that emerged with the global war on terror, it's very much kind of sedimented on top of this of other kinds of communal issues that have been longstanding in India. So how is the figure of the Muslim man and woman being racialized as suspicious, as terrorist, as foreign, as alien? And how is that working out in terms of gender and sexuality, right? And so there's more I could give you, like, some more resources. There's a woman, I forget her first name, Jaya Wardene, works on racialized casteism in the Indian Ocean, and she might be a good resource because she works on Sri Lanka as well. And then there's so much on dealing with, like, race and Blackness in India. Like Professor Gabriel Dettatreyan spoke earlier, and he's doing some of that work on African migrants in India, but also like Siddhis in Gujarat. So there's so many directions you could expand the project in, depending on what you want to do with it. So I'll just let you respond to any of that. But thank you for the awesome paper. Okay, so moving along. Arshad, I loved your paper. It was beautifully written paper. I loved reading about these different novels and I guess one autobiography about Hijra practices of community building outside of the traditional institutionalized Hijra Ghana. I actually wasn't aware that the character Anjum in Ministry of Utmost Happiness was based on Mona Ahmed. So I learned something, and not to be disrespectful, I just did not know. So I need to go back and read that book. But that was really excellent to see that. And I love that you brought the anti-Sikh communal violence in '84 in conversation with the more recent anti-Muslim violence in India, because I think that particular history is oftentimes like skipped, right? Even though it's really central to thinking about communal violence and this Hindu nationalist kind of hegemony in India in particular, and how you brought that all together with respect to the Hijra figure is so important. And I really enjoyed your reading your descriptions of certain moments in these novels and your interpretations of them. I really was drawn to your use of Munoz's Brown Commons, and you described it as the choreography of singularities that touch and connect but do not meld, a collectivity with and through the incommensurable. And that kind of helped you to get to this Hijra Commons idea. And then later on in the paper, you also use Leila Gandhi's affective cosmopolitanism, in which you talk about the capacity for radical kinship, and in this case, across these gender, sexuality, class, caste, communal boundaries. And I wanted to kind of hear you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about both of those, both the Brown Commons / Hijra Commons as an alternative, otherwise space, and then also this idea of contingent and situational relationalities and entanglements. And I was wondering, like, what exactly is the relationship between the two? Does radical kinship inform your idea of the Brown or Hijra Commons? It wasn't exactly clear towards the end of the paper, although maybe I just need to go back and look at it closer, because I was reading through all of them.
At this point, it is speculation.
But I liked just both of those theories that you were using and wondering how you arrived at them. And I was kind of wondering, like, what are the possibilities and limits of both of them? And were you arriving at some kind of synthesis through them? And I was also wondering about just the limitations of existing theories that we can use to talk about non-normative gender and queer life in South Asia. And so, like, what are the limitations of Indian post-colonial scholarship, especially subaltern studies, in like being able to grasp some of this stuff that's being written about clearly in novels, but not in scholarly work? And so I was wondering if that is what compelled you to move to queer theory in the US to kind of capture that. And I love how you talk about queer history of refusal. And that made me just think of, like, just if we're going to move in that direction of queer of color stuff, then there's, you know, like Rod Ferguson's queer of color critique and the ways in which he uses archival method to open up this whole world of, like, Black subaltern life in the US. I was also thinking about Moten and Harney's Undercommons, of course, when you use Munoz's Commons, and they're talking about the university, but that led to all this work in Black studies and fugitivity. And in Black feminist anthropology these days, there's been a big turn to performance theory, to embodiment, to dance. I'm thinking about, like, Amy Cox's work on the choreography of citizenship. And all of this is opening up possibilities for radical worlding, for thinking the otherwise, for other spaces of intimacy and sociality, right? So I'm just curious, like, how far you want to take this project into these interdisciplinary debates. And that's, I think, what we're grappling with in and out of South Asia. And then the last comment I had was, I did feel there was a strong thread of spirituality and divinity and the sacred with respect to the figure of the Hijra. in the texts and novels and in your own analysis. And so I was wondering about how you were opening up the space of the non-secular or the sacred with respect to the Hijra commons, and how you're using the sacred or the divine. It comes out with like the Sufi shrine, right? How are you mobilizing those categories with respect to other terms like religion or the secular, right? So I'll just leave that there, but it's a great paper and I'm looking forward to your work developing. It's really exciting. And, okay, so we got one more left, almost there. And Sonia, your research is so important. Oh my goodness, this is such unbelievably important work. And I'm so excited that you're doing it, although it must be really difficult to do this research. So your paper is looking at Pakistan's imbrication in the global war on terror. And you're really centering Pakistan, I think, both in American US empire and its war on terror, which we can talk about where that's at now, given the pullout in Afghanistan. But you're also interestingly locating Pakistan's place in the South Asian region's war on terror in general, which is also very, very complicated, right? And so I was really wondering about these overlapping geographies of the war on terror, and also the overlapping geopolitics of the war on terror. And in a way, kind of by doing this research in Pakistan, you're opening up all of this, this other complicated, these complicated frameworks that we need to understand for figuring out like what is imperialism, what is sub-imperialism, what is Pakistan doing to its own citizens, right? So I was curious about all of that, and just in terms of thinking about like, how would you frame your project within these bigger discussions, both in South Asia and in the larger war on terror? Within Pakistan, I really appreciated your focus on showing us how these two different frontier regions are viewed as suspect regions with suspect citizens. And I loved how you already located that within this longer genealogy of British Empire and the surveillance of these sort of pastoral or nomadic people who always had this kind of border crossing mobility. And the fact that they were unable to be properly settled made them suspect. And it was really great to see tracing those legacies in this paper. I think that you're almost like selling yourself too short in terms of how important your research is. And I would say really doubling down on strengthening, like, what are the stakes of focusing on this legal edifice or the legal technologies that you're mapping out for us, rather than just focusing on the broader counterterrorism legislation that we already know is there. But the fact that you've done all this research to show us actually there's this other layer of things that are happening, it seems so important, because we know that both of these layers are imbricated in human rights abuses under the cover of legality, and both are undermining any substantive sense of democracy in Pakistan. So we know that, but you're actually showing us how the state itself is working, right? In a way that maybe some of the other research hasn't been able to do, because you're uncovering this legal edifice. So it's almost like an ethnography of the state. And I was looking at your research as an anthropologist would. And in a way, I'm wondering, are you saying that this legal edifice is maybe having even a worse effect on the everyday experiences of targeted populations? Or is it a commensurable register of violence and discrimination that targeted populations are experiencing? There's also a sense, and Mandana mentioned this in her comments, that the constant fact that there's secrecy involved in this, and people don't really know exactly what's going on, and there's kind of like affect, like these emotions that are circulating in these spaces means that people are almost governing themselves in interesting ways with respect to the legal edifice. So all of that is really interesting. And you mentioned in your paper that you're not interested in material infrastructural violence, but the fact that people's mobility is being restricted to such a degree, or people feel that they have to restrict their own mobility, or that other people that they might be living next to might be putting them on a list, like their neighbors and friends. That makes me think, like, to what extent is this a kind of internal colonization that's happening? Do we see comparable things in Kashmir or Palestine? What could that, like, comparative literature do to help you with this analysis? I think a really important point that you make in the paper too is that you're showing us that there are these, like, hierarchies of citizenship that are being created within Pakistan, but also how maybe the normative citizen subjects are being recruited to do the work of the state also, right? So especially with that registry list in Lahore, that was really interesting. You know, working more through how race and racialization is operating in Pakistan, I think would also be a really interesting angle to push on this. And then race, of course, is gendered and sexualized. So I'm wondering about if you use that feminist intersectional analysis to look at how targeted populations are experiencing their lives in Pakistan, that might reveal even more about how these this legal edifice or these legal technologies are operating. So those are just some comments to kind of help, but the work seems so important, and I'm really excited about it. So I'll just end there, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you so much for those incredibly generous comments and questions, Anneeth. And I'm mindful of the time, and I'm kind of inspired, very inspired really, by the community of people gathered here who are across various time zones at odd hours, so thank you. And so, but mindful of the time, perhaps if panelists could respond, if possible, briefly, you know, to Anneeth's comments, that would be wonderful. And perhaps we can go in the order of papers that Anneeth invoked. So perhaps starting with Kelvin, and then Darakhsha, Arshad, and then Sonia.
Of course. Thank you so much for that, Irene. And thank you so much, Anneeth, for your really wonderful, really rich comments. I'll try to keep my responses very brief, but I think that on your first question about methodology and thinking about the Indian Ocean as a space, there was a really fruitful question for me, because I think that here there are many different sort of multiple approaches that I'm sort of drawing from. On one hand, I'm really sort of inspired by Niall Green's formulation of the Indian Ocean as a heterotopic space of vernacular production that's perhaps characterized less by equality and by cosmopolitanism, but more by, you know, the competition between different registers within this heterotopic sort of space of intellectual production. The idea of Indian Ocean as a method, I am really indebted to the work of Isabel Hofmeyr and Renisa Mawani in thinking about oceans as method. But I think that there are some newer approaches as well that I'm really drawn to. Firstly, in thinking about the materiality of different paper technologies that emerged during this period. So here I'm really sort of drawing on the work of someone like Bhavani Raman or Fadila Yahya, who is in the audience with us today, on thinking about the specificity of and the materiality of different forms of paper technology that emerged in the early 20th century. So the newspaper as a particular technology, or legal documents as a particular technology, or the passport as a particular technology. And secondly, I'm really sort of inspired by some of the works in anthropology of religion, especially. So thinking about the pioneering work of someone like Talal Asad, but also recent work by scholars like Terence Sevilla on how religious modalities might offer us different ways of thinking about non-secular forms of being and non-secular sort of cosmologies of inhabiting the world. To keep this quick on the second question on the print archive and what gets left out, and on subaltern figures, that's such an important question, and I'm so glad that you raised that, Anneeth, because I think that that is a limit point that I sort of continually encounter in my own archival work as well. There's no way for me to, you know, recuperate or ventriloquize, and it's both, untenable and unethical to ventriloquize the voices of these subaltern figures. I think that in that regard, what has perhaps been more fruitful for me to think about would be to think about the afterlives of this text as something that's perhaps not simply circumscribed by the context of their publication or production, but as something with incredibly durable afterlives in the space of the plantation or the port. So many of these newspapers, even though they were intended for a literate audience, but they would be read out loud, for instance, at the space of a barrack or the space of a plantation. And these ideas were not really circumscribed to the immediate text that they were on. And I think that, in the absence of being able to transparently reconstruct these subjectivities, I think that there is a way of thinking more critically and ethnographically about the print archive itself and its afterlives that may provide a slice into thinking about these marginalized figures who get left out of the archive. And your third really important question on inheritances, I really appreciate that, because even as a historian, I'm really sort of interested in thinking ethnographically and drawing on anthropological methods. And one thing that I really do want to push back on is this idea of post-colonial closure, because as you have pointed out, there are forms of migration that persist really into the late 20th century and up to today. And I think that here, I think that, one domain that has been incredibly sort of effective in reflecting this has been literature and cultural production. So if one sort of recent cultural work that I think really embodies the spirit of post-colonial inheritances and continuities is this documentary From Gulf to Gulf that I find just really incredibly inspiring as a statement on continuing transoceanic migrations. But here I'm really sort of inspired by for instance, your work, Anneeth, on past, present, and future, on thinking about temporality and how different forms, different registers of temporality might cohere within one historical moment. And I think that that form of really historicizing temporality as a category provides ways for thinking about how, even within one punctual historical context, there are multiple registers of temporality that are being invoked. And there is a future-oriented, perhaps, vision that we today from our political present might be able to sort of reflect on. I'm also really inspired here by the work of scholars like Nilofer Qadir on thinking about how there are afterlives of Indian Ocean sort of connections that persist really into the post-colonial period. And lastly, I think that this question becomes all the more important because I think that there is simply no way of making sense of many of the developments in South and Southeast Asia, absent of this sort of broader perspective of how these different modes of migration, that are both coerced and voluntary persist into the present. There's no way of making sense of the Rohingya crisis except as an Indian Ocean crisis. There's no way of making sense of climate refugees migrating out of Bangladesh today except as an Indian Ocean crisis. And I think that these are sort of important questions to grapple with from our vantage point today. Thank you again so much for your comments.
Thank you so much, Kelvin, for that. And Darakhsha, perhaps, if you'd also like to briefly respond.
Hi, and thank you so much, Anneeth, for your comments and and your insights, as well as pushing me to sort of think more than I have already about some of the things. And I have come across Kumari Jayawardhana's texts, and as well as other feminist scholars that have questioned, that have critiqued the nation state in Sri Lanka, because my research topic is about, as I said, gender nationalism is post-colonial South Asia. The focus is on India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So it's really an attempt to understand how colonialism helped in the development of the nationalist identities in these gender nationalist identities in these regions, and how they sort of developed into the present form that they exist as today, and how these exclusivist masculine forms of nationalism also are responsible for the conflicts, the interstate conflicts between in these countries. So that is by and large what my topic is about. As far as race is concerned, race in South Asia is not something that I had studied a lot of, and this conference really gave me the opportunity to write about it. And educate myself about it. And so I'm really grateful. I would really love to, read more about the other scholars that you mentioned, because it is very interesting and it could, I think, inform my topic in very beneficial ways. As far as comparative, the method you said, you mentioned, I'm grateful for that you noticed and you pointed it out, because I mean, of course, whenever you worked on something, it's really wonderful when somebody does point out these things. I think comparative study in South Asia especially is important. Comparative studies in general are important because I think it helps us to trace a pattern across different societies, and that also because South Asian communities are so deeply interlinked with one another in so many different ways, and this is not a standalone incident. This is whatever has happened in India or whatever has happened in Sri Lanka. These are not standalone experiences. These are not standalone examples. They were part of a project, and there are certain patterns to it according to which they moved. And what really these comparisons can tell us is that there is the end to it is quite apparent. That we can learn from one another's experiences. This is what ultimately it is, construction of the past in order to legitimize the current identity. This is what a gendered analysis, I hope, exposes the constructions and the inherent gendered structure of these constructions, and how that leads to how that connects to violence and conflicts in these regions today. And definitely Sri Lanka's example can serve as a sort of example for India today, even though the Sri Lankan conflict is far from over, which is something I've also mentioned in the presentation. And that's just because something lies dormant for some time doesn't mean it has no potential to flare up again, because it did not end in reconciliation. It ended with repression, which is the case with a lot of insurgencies in India as well, in the Northeast, and where I think this is something that Anisha Gogoi might have mentioned in another one of the panels. I unfortunately did not attend it, but I did watch a presentation, so I'm aware of that. And where, attempts have been made to have compromises with the ethnic sort of strong men, so as to say, in order to continue the cycle of internal colonization, and in order to maintain, broker these sort of compromises with these ethnic strongmen in order to repress these insurgencies, but they never really go away because the resentments are not being addressed at all. So that's really my rather long and drawn out answer to your comparative question. As far as the examples of Islamophobia all over the world, I think can be explained, or really can be, I think I can draw parallels to it, parallels with this very unacademic sounding term that was really prevalent in India a couple of months back, of love jihad. This was, it's a way of sort of looking at the Muslim community as the other, as the enemy, because it's a known strategy of war to disrupt the honor of the woman who was supposed to represent the territory of the nation, or was supposed to represent the values, the culture of the community. So it has been seen in many wars and conflicts, and this is the kind of narrative that, at least in India, is being put forward, that the men of the other community are, they want to basically they are a threat to the women of our community. So it's also the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, had also said that the Hindu women are the nation's daughters. which I mean, amongst other things, he's a self-styled monk. So I mean, he's not talking about his biological daughters. It's just the patriarchal state being considering women as their daughters that they must protect, and irrespective of whether they want this protection or not. And there's a urge to act as the protector of Muslim women as well, which is again, these are just things that they come up with sometimes. So yeah, I mean, these are really things that I feel like one can draw parallels to how it is manifesting worldwide, in that you see the Muslims as sort of the other from which the women of our community face danger, and so we must protect them. So we must, they are basically posing a threat to the idea of us, which is something that's often seen between the ruler and the ruled, and us and them. So I hope
Thank you so much, Darakhsha. Thank you so much. And we'll now move to Arshad and then to Sonia.
So thank you, Anneeth, for all the questions and all the you're sending me in a new direction. I really like that. So I haven't thought of Ferguson and Moulton, but I do realize that I could look at before I get to Ferguson, and I could look at some of the black trans critics who've already talked about fugitivity within the context of black trans mobility. But when I'm talking about the Hijra figure, especially the Hijra figure which is represented in literature and film, I am struggling with the limits of course, as you say, the existing theories. The Hijra figure has been primarily an anthropological subject, and now a subject of ethnographic studies. They're entirely absent from subaltern studies, even though they were defined as a criminal tribe. But what attracts me to Munoz's ideas is that he leaves it sort of unsettled. But I think I will try to sort of put Munoz and Leela Gandhi in conversation together, which I haven't really thought of doing. But I'm also thinking that maybe these relationships, maybe these intimacies are not sort of definable through American queer ideas, American queer and trans ideas, because even the category of transgender is when it travels to India, it's taken up primarily through governmental ideas and then imposed on the Hijra community. So there are lots of other sort of conflicts to talk about there. In terms of spirituality, I'm interested in considering how the Hindu Hindu idea of the divine Hijra is appropriated by Hindu nationalism, and there is some work on that. But when I see that there is a discussion of Sufi traditions, especially in Roy, and even to consider the Mona Ahmed's narrative in a Muslim graveyard, those sort of narratives also interrupt the idea of the Hindu Hijra divine, which is as appropriated by Hindu nationalism, even though some of the scholars who've written about the homoerotic expressions in the Sufi, in the South Asian Sufi tradition as a sort of examples of ahistorical Indian queer authenticity, which I think is kind of a dangerous idea that again is interrupted by Hijra presence. So yeah, those are the things that I'll be looking at. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much, Arshad, for that. And finally, Sonia, if you could offer some brief, you can respond briefly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anneeth. This was really wonderful and given me a lot of things that I need to think through. So, which I'm going to be doing, but I'm just going to be brief. I think one of the questions you asked about the stakes of the project, it's actually, yeah, it's very, very important. And I think I don't really speak to it maybe in this paper, but I think you're right that this is, and the reason why I'm interested in doing this larger project is also because it's, it's really this kind of work which hasn't been done about Pakistan, even though it's been it's talked about so much in the context of the war on terror, yet really what has happened within Pakistan, or sort of its importance to understanding the larger sort of, the war on terrorist context, and specifically the legal sort of side of it is really not really been looked at. So, so yeah, I think this is the work that I'm doing is an attempt to understand on the ground how these sort of laws are playing out, and it's also interesting because a lot of these the kind of what I even sort of hint at in my paper in terms of the state now has a lot more resources and narrative at its disposal. These are often coming from sort of much more global kind of pressure to sort of enact certain kinds of laws and policies, but then and the way that the state in fact ends up doing it and who it actually targets, it's actually really, really interesting. But I think it also is important to understand, to be able to see what the war on terror has actually sort of, brought about on the ground in the center of where, the theaters of war. Because I think mostly when we've spoken about these kinds of effects, and it's been about the global north and Muslim minorities in the global north, but not so much in Muslim majority context. So that's really sort of why I'm interested in doing this project now, how I see the stakes of it. And yes, absolutely, in terms of like the geopolitics of it, and Pakistan is both the US, it's part of the US empire and is a US colony. I think that's also something that I'm hoping to sort of flesh out as the project develops, because it's really more both the sort of longer colonial, British colonial histories, which I think South Asia generally in Pakistan is read as like being part of this British colonial history, but much less so in specifically because Pakistan's case, I think, is kind of different from India in the context of it being almost like a US colony in some ways. So that's really specific about Pakistan's experience under the war on terror. So yes, and I think it's interesting to think of it as an ethnography of the state. I did initially imagine this as an ethnography, but it changed a little bit over time. It's much more of a social legal project now. But yes, I think I'm definitely trying to sort of read the state as it's playing out on the ground. And thank you so much for all of your comments. I think I'm going to be thinking much more deeply about it. The feminist work I haven't really been thinking about, just because of the nature of it, and my interlocutors are so overwhelmingly male. So I haven't really thought about it as what would it mean to look at it through feminist sort of perspectives. But definitely I'm going to be doing that.
Thank you so much for that, Sonia. Yeah, that's a lot. And I'm not quite sure how to, because I know we're well beyond time. And so, yeah, so I don't know if people are still keen to talk at this hour, but from my side, I'm just going to say thank you so much for such a generative discussion, and for agreeing to meet at this hour, at this time. I know that it's the best time zone that we could come up with, given the various time zones that are represented on this panel. But yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to, further engage, please feel free to do so. Or alternatively, you can, I suppose we can continue to have email exchanges and continue to carry on these conversations forward. And we hope to build our website in a way that's live and interactive going forward. And so we'll share further details on that as we go along. But yeah, if anyone wants to raise any final comments before we close, please feel free to do so.
I just want to say thank you for organizing a great conference and, writing amazing papers, and really it was excellent. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mandana.
Not easy right now with the pandemic and everything else going on, and staying on top of grad work and classes and writing papers, etc. So thank you so much. This has been so fantastic, and I'm really excited to watch the videos of the other sessions as well.
Yes, we're in the process of editing them and making them presentable for public view. And so that should be done hopefully in the next 1-2 weeks. And so we'll definitely send that information across and perhaps upload them onto a Dropbox folder, actually onto our website. So we will send all this information across. But thank you all so very much for being so engaged, for staying up with us at this hour or waking up, depending on where you are. But thank you. And it's been such a wonderful 2 days. And we're hoping to do this annually, perhaps. That's our desire. But we hope to stay in touch, and we'll continue these conversations moving forward. But thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Mandana and Anneeth for taking the time to engage so deeply, so thoughtfully with each paper. It was truly remarkable. Thank you.